A millionaire found an elderly woman in a wheelchair lost in the forest and took her home to stay with his blind daughter. When he arrived home by surprise, he was shocked by what the elderly woman did with his daughter. The rain drummed against the windshield of the black sedan as Michael Matthews drove along the winding road that cut through the dense forest. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from the cold night, but from the frustration still burning in his chest after the disastrous meeting. At 42, he had built a business empire with his own hands, but today he almost lost the most important contract of his career because of a misunderstanding that could have been avoided. The man with graying hair at the temples and tired brown eyes muttered to himself as he accelerated. 3 hours wasted trying to explain something obvious to people who don't want to understand. How can I save my company if I can't even save my own family? The weight of responsibility crushed his broad shoulders as he thought of Catherine, his 16-year-old daughter, who had become a shadow of what she once was. 3 years had passed since the accident that changed their lives forever. 3 years since he lost his wife Ellen and watched his daughter lose her sight in the blink of an eye. The cheerful, full of life girl who used to run down the hallways of the mansion singing her favorite songs now refused to leave her room, rejecting any form of psychological help or attempt at connection. Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the familiar guilt rise up his throat like bitter bile, and recalled the last words Catherine had shouted at him the previous morning. "You don't understand anything about what I feel, Dad. You can still see everything we lost, but I only see eternal darkness." The memory of that argument tormented him as the rain intensified, turning the road into a treacherous surface that reflected his own turbulent emotions. Michael had been driving this route for 15 years, knew every curve and every pothole. But that night everything seemed different, darker, as if the forest was mirroring the state of his soul. He had tried everything to help Catherine, the best doctors, specialized therapists, braille teachers, even a guide dog that she categorically refused. Each attempt was met with screams, tears, and even greater isolation, until Michael began to feel like a stranger in his own home. Ellen would know what to do, he thought, allowing himself for a moment the pain of missing his wife. She always knew how to talk to Catherine, how to touch her heart in a way I never could. The car's headlights cut through the darkness of the forest when something unusual caught his attention on the side of the road. A solitary figure was sitting in a wheelchair, completely motionless under the light drizzle falling. Michael slowed down, frowning as he tried to understand what a person in a wheelchair would be doing alone on an isolated road at 10 o'clock at night. The woman seemed elderly, her soaked clothes clinging to her fragile body, and she rocked back and forth in a repetitive movement that indicated despair or mental confusion. He stopped the car a few meters ahead and observed through the rearview mirror, fighting against the instinct to simply continue his journey and avoid complications. But an inner voice insisted, "If it were Catherine there, abandoned and defenseless, would you want someone to drive right past?" Michael got out of the car and was immediately hit by the full force of the approaching storm. The wind howled through the tall trees, creating a supernatural sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. He walked slowly toward the woman, his footsteps sinking into the soft mud at the roadside, and he could hear his own steps echoing strangely in the silent night. The rain wet his hair as he approached, and he could see that it was a woman of approximately 75 years old, with disheveled white hair and clothes that were once elegant, but now dirty and torn. Her blue eyes were glazed over, lost somewhere between confusion and terror, and she muttered incomprehensible words to herself, like a broken prayer or a desperate plea. "Ma'am, are you all right? What are you doing out here alone at this hour?" he asked in a soft voice, trying not to frighten her further. The woman startled at his approach as if she had been ripped from a deep trance and blinked several times trying to focus on reality. Her trembling hands gripped the side of the chair tightly, knuckles turning white from the effort, and Michael noticed that her nails were broken and dirty, as if she had tried to crawl or desperately grab onto something. She wore a coat too thin for the weather, and her legs were covered only by a soaked blanket that looked more like a rag, revealing a neglect that made Michael's heart tighten. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out hoarse and broken, carrying a vulnerability that touched something deep in the businessman's heart. They forgot me here. The shelter group went out for a walk in the woods, said it would be just an hour, but when I came out of the public bathroom to return to the group, the bus had already left with everyone. She sobbed between words, and Michael felt his stomach tighten as he imagined the despair that woman must have felt upon realizing she had been abandoned. Susan continued her broken narrative, the words coming out like fragments of a reality she still couldn't fully process. I waited in the same place where they left me, thought they would come back when they realized I wasn't on the bus. But the hours passed, it got dark, it started to rain, and nobody came to get me. Her tears mixed with the rainwater, creating saline streams that ran down her wrinkled cheeks. I tried to push my wheelchair along the road, but it's too heavy and my hands don't have strength anymore. I fell twice trying to reach the main road, hurt my shoulder, and then just sat here waiting for someone to appear. The mental image of that fragile woman desperately trying to save herself alone in the darkness made Michael feel a dull anger against the people responsible for her. Michael looked around the deserted road, searching for signs of other vehicles or people, but found only the silence of the forest and the constant sound of rain that now fell more intensely. He took his cell phone from his pocket and checked the screen, but as expected, there was no signal in that isolated region surrounded by mountains and dense vegetation. The elderly woman continued to shiver, and he noticed that her lips were beginning to turn bluish from the cold, a worrying sign of initial hypothermia. The situation was clear. If he didn't do something immediately, that woman could die from cold before dawn. He put away the phone and crouched again beside her, studying her face marked by time and pain, looking for signs of serious injuries or health problems that could complicate the situation. "What is your name, ma'am?" "I'll take you to a safe place where you can warm up, and then we'll try to contact the shelter." "Susan," she answered with difficulty, wiping her nose with the wet sleeve of her coat, leaving a dark stain on the already compromised fabric. "My name is Susan, and I just want to go home, but sometimes I get confused and don't know where my home is anymore. Sometimes I don't remember things right. Doctors say it's normal for someone my age, but I remember they promised not to leave me alone." Her words revealed not only the physical abandonment, but also the mental confusion that afflicted her, and Michael realized he was facing a more complex situation than he had initially imagined. She continued speaking, her words coming out in broken bursts that mixed present and past. "Please, sir, don't leave me here in the darkness. I've been afraid of the dark since I was little. My mother used to light a candle beside my bed, and now that I'm old, the fear has only gotten worse." Susan's account awakened in Michael painful memories of his own daughter, who had also developed an excessive fear of darkness after losing her sight. Catherine used to wake up screaming in the middle of the night, trapped between the dream world where she could still see and the cruel reality of her permanent blindness. "I understand your fear, Susan. My daughter also fights against darkness every day, albeit in a different way than yours," he said, surprising himself with the ease with which he shared something so intimate with a stranger. There was something in Susan's vulnerability that broke down his usual defenses, perhaps because he recognized in her the same helplessness he saw in Catherine. "I'll take you to my house, where you'll be safe and warm. Tomorrow we'll resolve how to find the people from the shelter." Michael felt an internal conflict growing in his chest as he quickly evaluated his limited options. His life was already complicated enough with Catherine's problems and the constant pressures of work, and bringing a stranger home could create more problems than he could handle at the moment. On the other hand, leaving a vulnerable elderly woman on an isolated road during an intensifying storm went against all the values his parents had taught him about compassion and social responsibility. He thought of Catherine locked in her room, refusing to accept help from anyone, and imagined how he would feel if she knew her father had passed by someone who needed help and simply continued on his way for convenience. The decision he made at that moment would change their lives forever, although he didn't know it yet. "Susan, I can't leave you here. I'll take you to my house where you can recover from this ordeal." The expression of relief on Susan's face was so intense that Michael felt a lump in his throat and had to look away for a moment. She extended a trembling hand and lightly touched his arm, her icy fingers contrasting with the human warmth that still remained in his body despite the rain. Fresh tears began to roll down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of genuine gratitude, not absolute despair. "Thank you, young man. I don't know how to thank you for your kindness. It's been so long since anyone has treated me with gentleness that I had lost hope that good people still existed in the world." Her words carried decades of loneliness and abandonment, and Michael wondered what kind of life this woman had led to reach a point where the simple kindness of a stranger surprised her so deeply. Susan continued talking while Michael mentally prepared the logistics of helping her, her words revealing layers of pain that went far beyond the abandonment of that night. "You know, I used to be an important person. I had a profession, a beautiful home, people who respected me. I worked for 40 years as a sculptor. My works were in important galleries, and I was recognized for my talent." She paused, looking at her arthritic hands as if trying to see in them the vestiges of lost skill. "But when age came, and my mind began to fail sometimes, people changed with me. First came distrust, then impatience, and finally complete abandonment. It's as if I had become invisible, irrelevant, a burden to everyone around me." Michael positioned the car so that the back door was aligned with Susan's wheelchair, facilitating the transfer and protecting her from the rain that was now falling torrentially. The wheelchair was old and heavy, clearly having seen many years of use, but it was well maintained, suggesting that someone had once cared enough to keep it in good condition. He helped Susan settle into the back seat, noticing how she moved with difficulty, not just because of age, but also from the stiffness caused by hours exposed to the cold dampness. Her soaked clothes left a small puddle on the leather seat, but Michael didn't mind, concerned only with ensuring she was comfortable and safe. He folded the wheelchair carefully and placed it in the trunk, taking precautions not to damage it, as he knew that for Susan that chair represented her only form of mobility and independence in the world. "The road to my house takes about 20 minutes, but I promise to drive carefully so you feel safe," he said, adjusting the rearview mirror so he could observe her during the journey. During the drive along the winding road, Michael turned the car heater to maximum and observed Susan in the rearview mirror as she gradually stopped shaking violently. Her clothes were still wet and uncomfortably clung to her fragile body, but at least now she was protected from the relentless rain and the icy wind that howled outside. The elderly woman looked out the window with a distant and melancholic expression, as if she were trying to recognize familiar places in a landscape that constantly changed under the intermittent light of the headlights. Occasionally she muttered some words to herself, fragments of memories or disconnected thoughts that Michael couldn't completely comprehend, but which seemed to bring her some comfort. "Susan, do you have family nearby? Someone who should be looking for you at this moment?" he asked gently, trying to gather information that might help resolve the situation the next day. Susan remained silent for a long moment, her gaze lost in the dark landscape passing by the window, and when she finally responded, her voice carried a deep sadness that made Michael regret having asked the question. "I once had a family, a beautiful, united family, but people grow tired of caring for confused old folks like me. My granddaughter Jessica took me to the shelter 2 years ago, said it was for my own good, that there I would have specialized professional care and companionship from people my age." She paused, wiping away a stubborn tear that insisted on falling despite her efforts to control herself. "But I think she just wanted to get rid of the burden I had become after I started getting confused more frequently. I can't really blame her. I'm no longer the strong and independent grandmother I used to be, the one who made delicious cakes and told enchanting stories." Susan's words echoed inside the car, creating a heavy atmosphere charged with emotion that made Michael reflect deeply on his own family relationships. He thought about Catherine, isolated in her room for 3 years, and wondered if his daughter also felt like a burden to him, if she noticed his frustration in moments when he didn't know how to help her. The pain in Susan's voice was almost palpable, and Michael realized he was facing someone who had lost not only her physical autonomy, but also her dignity and her place in the world. "I'm sure your granddaughter cares about you more than you imagine," he said, trying to offer some genuine comfort. "Sometimes people make difficult decisions because they don't know how to handle complex situations, not because they don't truly care. Love sometimes expresses itself in ways we don't immediately understand." Susan sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of many disappointments accumulated over the years. "Perhaps you're right, young man. but it's hard to believe that when you're sitting alone in a wheelchair in the middle of a storm, waiting for someone to remember you exist. At the shelter, we're just numbers, routines to be fulfilled, medications to be administered at the right time. She turned slightly to look at Michael through the rearview mirror, and he could see in her eyes a mixture of gratitude and despair that touched him deeply. You're the first person in months who treats me like a human being with feelings and stories to tell. At the shelter, they are efficient and fulfill their obligations, but there's no human warmth, no genuine interest in who we are beyond our medical diagnoses. When they finally arrived at Michael's property, the automatic gates opened with a soft hum, revealing an imposing two-story mansion with meticulously maintained gardens and a central fountain that shone majestically under the carefully planned exterior lighting. Susan observed the house through the car window, her eyes widening slightly as she realized the magnitude and elegance of the property that stretched before her. "My God, what a magnificent place," she murmured with genuine admiration. But Michael could hear a growing note of insecurity in her voice, as if she felt completely inadequate to be in such a refined environment. The house really was impressive, with its classic architecture and luxury finishes visible even in the darkness. But for Michael, it had become a mausoleum of painful memories where laughter echoed that hadn't been heard for 3 long years. Michael parked near the main entrance, protected by an elegant portico that would keep them dry during the transfer, and turned off the engine with a sigh of relief. He rushed to open the door for Susan before retrieving her wheelchair from the trunk, working quickly despite the rain that continued falling with intensity. The rain had diminished slightly to a persistent drizzle, but it was still enough to get wet, so he moved efficiently to set up the chair and help Susan settle into it again. He noticed how she moved more fluidly, now that she had warmed up during the trip, although she still demonstrated obvious fragility in every careful movement. "My housekeeper Margaret has lived here with us for 15 years and takes care of the house as if it were her own family," he explained, while pushing the chair toward the main door. "She may seem a bit serious and suspicious at first, especially with strangers, but she has a genuinely kind heart and will take very good care of you." When Michael rang the doorbell, Susan startled slightly at the melodious sound that echoed through the interior of the house, and they heard hurried footsteps coming from somewhere on the ground floor, followed by the familiar sound of multiple security locks being opened one by one. Margaret had always been extremely cautious with family security, especially after the traumatic accident that changed their lives forever, and she kept the house locked like a true fortress during nighttime hours. The massive carved wooden door opened slowly, revealing a robust and dignified 58-year-old woman, with grey hair tied in an impeccable bun and a dark robe indicating that she was already preparing for her nightly rest. Her dark brown eyes, always alert and protective, first turned to Michael with an expression of maternal concern. But when she lowered her gaze and saw Susan sitting in the wheelchair, her expression changed completely and dramatically. Margaret's face went through a series of intense and contradictory emotions as she studied Susan's delicate features more carefully under the soft light of the entrance. First came the natural confusion of finding a stranger at the door of his home on a stormy night, then a gradual recognition that made her eyebrows furrow in concentration, and finally an expression of genuine and disturbing shock that made Michael frown with growing concern. The housekeeper took an instinctive step backward, her hand automatically rising to cover her mouth in a gesture of total surprise, and her eyebrows joined in an expression of absolute disbelief that she couldn't hide. Susan also seemed to recognize Margaret immediately, as her eyes widened with what appeared to be a mixture of surprise and fear, and she tried to shrink into the chair, as if wanting to disappear or become invisible. The tension between the two women was palpable and charged with electricity, permeated with a complex history that Michael was completely unaware of, but that clearly involved significant events from the past. "Margaret, I found Mrs. Susan on an isolated road in the forest, abandoned by the shelter group and exposed to the cold of the storm. She urgently needs a safe place to spend the night and recover from this terrible experience," Michael explained carefully, closely observing his housekeeper's intense reaction and trying to understand the source of the obvious tension between the two women. Margaret remained completely still for several seconds that seemed eternal, her eyes fixed on Susan, as if she were seeing a disturbing ghost from the past that had returned to haunt her. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the sound of rain falling on the porch and the heavy breathing of the three people involved in that tension-filled moment. When Margaret finally managed to speak, her voice came out trembling and laden with a deep emotion that Michael had rarely seen in the normally controlled and efficient woman. "Mr. Michael," she said, swallowing hard and looking directly into his eyes with a disturbing intensity, "you don't know who you've brought into the house. This woman." The heavy silence that settled in the mansion's entrance was broken only by the sound of Margaret's labored breathing, who remained motionless like a statue, her eyes fixed on Susan with a mixture of horror and recognition that made Michael feel a chill down his spine. The housekeeper seemed to be struggling internally, her hands trembling slightly as she decided whether or not to reveal what she knew about the woman her employer had brought home. Susan, for her part, lowered her head as if trying to hide, her hands gripping the arms of the wheelchair with a force that made her knuckles turn white. Finally, Margaret found her voice, though it came out hoarse and laden with emotions she rarely showed. "Mr. Michael, this woman, she is Susan Williams, the one everyone in the old neighborhood knew as the Lonely Witch. You cannot let her into this house, not after everything she has done." Michael felt the world spin slightly upon hearing Margaret's words, but forced himself to maintain his composure as he pushed Susan's wheelchair into the house, protecting her from the rain still falling outside. The housekeeper stepped back a few paces, clearly uncomfortable with the elderly woman's presence, but Michael couldn't leave a fragile and wet woman outside just because of vague accusations from the past. "Margaret, regardless of what happened before, this lady was abandoned in a storm and needs basic medical care. We can discuss the rest after she is dry and warm," he said firmly, although his own curiosity about Susan's past was rapidly growing. "Now help me take her to the living room, and then bring some dry towels and perhaps a cup of hot tea." Margaret hesitated for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, her principles of hospitality fighting against her prejudices and fears from the past. She looked alternately at Michael and Susan, who remained downcast and trembling slightly, not just from the cold, but apparently from the weight of memories that Margaret's presence had awakened. "Mr. Michael," Margaret said in a controlled but tense voice, "you don't understand the gravity of the situation. This woman destroyed the lives of entire families 10 years ago. She falsely accused our neighbors of stealing her savings, invented elaborate stories about conspiracies against her, and dragged innocent people into a legal process that ruined their reputations and their livelihoods." She paused, looking directly at Susan, who finally raised her eyes with an expression of deep pain. Families lost their homes, men lost their jobs, children were humiliated at school because of the lies this woman spread when her mind began to fail. Susan finally found the courage to speak, her voice coming out as a broken whisper that echoed through the silent entrance of the mansion. "Margaret is right about everything she said. I did terrible things when my mind was confused. I accused good people of crimes they never committed, and the worst part is that at the time I truly believed I was telling the truth." Tears fell as she continued, forcing herself to face the reality of her past actions. "I had started to develop dementia, but nobody knew that yet, not even me. When I began to forget where I kept my things, when I could no longer find my important belongings, my confused mind created explanations that involved other people stealing from me." She looked directly at Margaret, her blue eyes full of genuine remorse. "I know my apologies cannot undo the harm I caused, but you need to know that I would pay any price to go back in time and prevent those events from happening." The revelation hit Michael like a punch to the stomach, and he suddenly found himself torn between the compassion he felt for the fragile woman in her wheelchair and the understanding of the gravity of the actions she had committed in the past. He himself had been a victim of unfair judgments after the accident that cost his wife's life and his daughter's vision, when some people whispered that he could have avoided the tragedy if he had been more careful. "Margaret, I understand your concern and completely respect your feelings about this situation, but I also know what it's like to be judged by the worst decisions or moments of our lives," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Susan was ill when she did these things, and although that doesn't excuse the damage caused, perhaps it's time to consider that she too was a victim of her own medical condition." He looked at both women, realizing he was navigating very deep emotional waters. Everyone deserves a second chance, especially when the circumstances of their past actions were not entirely their responsibility. Margaret crossed her arms over her chest, her body language making it clear that she was not convinced by Michael's arguments. "Mr. Michael, you are a good and generous man, but you are also naive about certain realities of life. I personally saw what this woman did to a family. A man lost his job as an accountant when his reputation was destroyed by false accusations, and they had to move to another state because nobody trusted them anymore." Her voice became more intense as she recalled the painful events. "Mrs. Berea had a nervous breakdown because of the stress from the legal process, and their children were discriminated against at school because everyone believed they came from a family of thieves." She pointed directly at Susan, who shrank even further into her chair. "This woman may seem harmless now, but the damage she caused was real and permanent, and I cannot pretend it never happened." Susan lifted her head with visible effort, as if the weight of guilt made even this simple movement a Herculean task. "Margaret, I completely understand your anger and your distrust, and I don't expect you to forgive me or trust me again. But I need you to know that since doctors diagnosed my early dementia, and I understood what I had done, not a day has passed without me thinking about the families I harmed." Her voice gained a little more strength as she continued, as if finally having the opportunity to explain herself gave her some energy. "I tried to find ways to compensate for the damage I caused, but I discovered that my family had sold all my possessions to pay for legal expenses, and I had nothing of value left to offer as reparation." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was institutionalized soon after the diagnosis, and since then I've lived with the constant guilt of knowing that I destroyed innocent lives during my episodes of mental confusion." Michael observed the interaction between the two women, realizing he was witnessing a confrontation that had been years in the making. The genuine pain in Susan's voice was undeniable, as was Margaret's justified anger, and he found himself genuinely divided about what would be the right decision to make. "Margaret, I completely understand your position, and I won't minimize the gravity of what happened in the past. But look at this woman. She is sick, scared, and was abandoned in a storm by people who should have been taking care of her," he said, gently gesturing towards Susan. "I'm not asking you to forget the past or to completely trust her. I'm just suggesting that we give her a chance to prove that she is no longer the same confused and troubled person from years ago." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Just one night, so she can recover from this traumatic experience. Tomorrow we'll make a more permanent decision about what to do." Margaret's expression hardened even more, and she stepped toward Michael, her 15 years of loyalty manifesting in a way he had rarely seen. "Mr. Michael, if you insist on keeping this woman in the house, then I can no longer continue working here. I cannot serve under the same roof as someone who destroyed the lives of people I knew and respected." Her voice trembled slightly, revealing how difficult it was for her to make such an ultimatum. "You have been more than an employer to me. You have been like family, but there are limits to what I can accept, and hosting Susan Williams is one of them." She looked directly into Michael's eyes, her determination unwavering. "I will pack my bags tonight and leave in the morning, because I cannot consciously remain in a house where this woman is present." Margaret's ultimatum hit Michael like lightning, and he realized he was about to lose not only an exceptional housekeeper, but also one of the few people who had remained by his family's side during the most difficult years after the accident. Margaret had been the pillar of stability that kept the house running when he was lost in his own grief and when Catherine completely isolated herself from the world. "Margaret, please don't make such a drastic decision based on emotions of the moment. You have been part of this family for 15 years, and Catherine and I depend on you more than we can express," he pleaded, feeling the weight of yet another possible loss. "I know I'm asking a lot, but I need you to trust my judgment just this once. Susan won't cause any trouble, I personally guarantee that." He looked at both women, realizing that his next decision could determine the future of everyone in the house. "If after a few days you still feel uncomfortable, then I will respect your decision, but please don't abandon our family because of a temporary situation." It was in this tense moment of emotional negotiation that a sharp, desperate scream echoed through the upper floor of the mansion, causing the three adults to freeze immediately. The sound was unmistakably Catherine's, and it carried a mixture of physical pain and emotional humiliation that made Michael's heart race. Without hesitating for a second, he ran toward the staircase, followed by Margaret, who temporarily forgot her argument with Susan upon hearing the distress of the young woman she had helped raise. Susan, determined not to be left behind, began pushing her wheelchair toward the small elevator that Michael had installed years ago for occasional accessibility needs. "Catherine!" shouted Michael, taking the steps 2 at a time. "I'm coming, dear, hold on." On the upper floor, they found Catherine fallen in the hallway between her bedroom and the bathroom, her legs bent at an odd angle and her hands desperately trying to find something solid to support herself. The 16-year-old was wearing only a thin nightgown, and Michael could see that she had tried to make the journey to the bathroom alone, refusing to call for help, even when she clearly needed it. Tears of frustration and pain ran down her face, and she pounded the floor with her fists, her anger directed both at her own inability and at the cruelty of her fate. "I hate this. I hate not even being able to go to the bathroom by myself without falling like a small child," she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty corridors. "Why can't I do anything right? Why does everything have to be so difficult and humiliating?" Michael immediately knelt beside Catherine, his hands carefully checking if she had hurt herself in the fall, while Margaret ran to fetch a blanket to cover the young woman. "Catherine, dear, let me help you up." "You didn't hurt yourself badly, did you?" he asked in a soft voice, trying to remain calm despite the scare he had received. Catherine pushed his hands away forcefully, her wounded independence being more painful than any physical injury she might have suffered in the fall. "Don't touch me. I don't need your pity or your help," she shouted, continuing to pound the floor in frustration. "Isn't it enough that I'm blind? Now I also have to be invalid and useless in everything I do?" Her voice broke into sobs, and Michael felt his own heart shatter seeing his daughter's deep pain. "I just wanted to be able to go to the bathroom by myself, without having to ask for help like a helpless baby." It was in this moment of extreme vulnerability that Susan reached the upper floor using the elevator, her wheelchair sliding silently down the hallway to where Catherine had fallen. The elderly woman observed the scene with eyes full of understanding and compassion, recognizing in the young woman a pain that she herself knew intimately, the pain of losing independence and feeling like a burden to others. Instead of offering immediate physical help, Susan simply positioned her chair near Catherine and began to speak in a soft, comforting voice that cut through the young woman's anguish. "Dear, I understand exactly what you're feeling right now. The humiliation of not being able to do simple things that used to be automatic, the anger of depending on others for basic needs, the feeling that you've lost your dignity along with your independence," said Susan, her voice carrying personal experience. "I know you don't know me and have no reason to trust me, but I want you to know that your pain and frustration are completely valid and understandable." Catherine momentarily stopped crying, surprised to hear an unknown voice that spoke about her feelings with such precision and understanding. She turned her face toward the voice, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline of the fall and the emotion of the moment. "Who are you? How did you get here?" she asked, her voice still broken by sobs, but with growing curiosity. Susan extended a trembling hand, not to touch Catherine without permission, but so the young woman could feel her presence if she wanted. "My name is Susan, and your father found me lost on a road during the storm. I also use a wheelchair, and know very well what it feels like to lose the ability to do things you always took for granted," she explained patiently. "I didn't come here to lecture you or give unsolicited advice, but I recognize a wounded soul when I see one, because I too am a wounded soul trying to find my way back to hope." Michael and Margaret watched the interaction in silence, both surprised by Susan's ability to instantly connect with Catherine in a way they had never managed. The young woman, who normally rejected any attempt at consolation or understanding, seemed genuinely interested in what Susan had to say. "You really understand what this is like?" asked Catherine, her voice losing some of its defensive bitterness. "Everyone keeps saying things will get better, that I'll adapt, that I'm strong and brave, but nobody really understands that some days I just want to be normal again." Susan nodded, even knowing Catherine couldn't see the gesture. "I understand perfectly, dear, And I can tell you something I've learned over the years. There's nothing wrong with feeling anger, sadness, or frustration about your situation. These emotions are a natural part of the process of dealing with major changes in our lives. Susan continued speaking, her voice gaining strength as she shared her own experience with loss of autonomy. When I first started needing the wheelchair, I felt exactly the same things you're feeling now. The anger at not being able to climb stairs, the humiliation of needing help for basic things, the feeling that I had become invisible to the world. She paused, allowing her words to penetrate Catherine's receptive mind. But I learned that our strength doesn't come from our ability to do everything alone. It comes from our ability to find new ways of living and accepting help when we need it, without diminishing our value as people. Catherine remained silent, absorbing Susan's words, and for the first time in months, Michael saw an expression of something like hope on his daughter's face. "Do you really believe it's possible to be happy again, even when everything has changed?" Catherine asked in a small voice. "I believe it's possible to find a different kind of happiness, one that doesn't depend on the capabilities we've lost, but on those we still have and those we can develop." Susan looked directly at Catherine, though she knew the young woman couldn't see her, and extended her mature, time-marked hand toward the girl fallen on the floor. "Catherine, I can teach you to see again, not with your eyes, but with your heart, with your hands, with all the other senses you still have. I can show you that beauty and purpose exist even in darkness, but you need to trust me completely, even without knowing me." Susan's words echoed down the silent corridor, carrying a promise that seemed impossible, but somehow resonated as truth in the ears of everyone present. Catherine extended her own tentative hand in Susan's voice direction, fresh tears beginning to run down her cheeks, but this time tears of something that resembled hope instead of despair. "Do you promise you won't give up on me if I'm difficult, or if it takes me a long time to learn?" she asked, her voice heavy with vulnerability. "I promise I will never give up on you, no matter how long it takes or how difficult the path is." Catherine was about to respond when the booming sound of the front door violently swinging open echoed through the entire house with a force that made everyone jump. The noise was of someone who had entered without ceremony, without ringing the doorbell or waiting to be received, suggesting urgency or an assumed right to be there. Heavy footsteps echoed across the ground floor, accompanied by a loud and agitated male voice shouting for Susan. "Susan, I know you're here! Someone from the shelter told me a man took you, and this is the only place in this direction where you could be." The voice was loaded with anger and determination, and the sound of objects being moved or examined reached the upper floor. Michael rose quickly, his posture becoming protective, while Margaret ran to see who had invaded the house. Susan visibly paled, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "He's come for me," she whispered, her voice full of fear. "I knew this moment would come sooner or later." The heavy footsteps echoed through the mansion like distant thunder, each one closer and more threatening than the last, while Michael helped Catherine rise from the corridor floor. The male voice shouting for Susan continued to reverberate through the corridors, carrying an anger that seemed to have been fueled by years of accumulated resentment. Susan remained motionless in her wheelchair, as if she had turned to stone, her hands trembling violently as she tried to process the reality that her past had finally caught up with her in this temporary refuge. Margaret ran down the stairs to confront the intruder, but Michael could hear from the intensity of the approaching shouts that the situation was quickly spinning out of control. "Susan, who is this person looking for you?" Michael asked urgently, trying to stay calm while protecting Catherine behind him. "It's the past I tried to forget, but that never forgot me," Susan whispered, her words almost inaudible. From the ground floor, Margaret's voice rose in an attempt to calm the man who had invaded the house. "Sir, you cannot simply enter private property like this. You need to identify yourself and explain what you want," she shouted. But her usual authority seemed to have little effect on the determined intruder. The response came as a roar of frustration. "I am James Johnson, and I've come for the woman who destroyed my family. I know she's here, and I won't leave until she's handed over to the authorities where she should have been years ago." The name Johnson made Susan groan softly, and Michael immediately realized the connection. This was the family Margaret had mentioned, the one destroyed by Susan's false accusations. The footsteps were now climbing the main staircase, and Michael knew he had only seconds to decide how to handle the explosive situation. "Catherine, go to your room and lock the door until I resolve this," he ordered, but his daughter shook her head with surprising determination. "No, Dad. If this house is going to receive Susan, then we will all face the consequences together." James appeared at the top of the staircase like a human storm, a man of approximately 40, with dark hair and eyes that burned with an intensity that made Michael instinctively position himself protectively in front of his family. His clothes were simple but clean, suggesting an honest worker, and his calloused hands indicated years of physical labor, probably necessary after the destruction of his family's previous career. When his eyes fixed on Susan, who remained motionless in her chair like a cornered animal, his expression contorted into a mixture of anger and pain that was almost palpable in the charged air. "There you are, Susan Williams," he said, his voice controlled but vibrating with repressed emotion. 15 years looking for you, 15 years wanting to look into your eyes and ask if it was worth destroying innocent families with your sick lies." He pointed directly at her, and Susan shrank even further into the chair. "Do you remember the Johnson family? Or has your mind conveniently erased the harm you did, as it always does when things get difficult for you?" Michael felt the tension in the air intensify to the point of being almost suffocating, and he knew he needed to intervene before the situation escalated into something irreversible. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you have important issues with Susan, but invading my home and threatening an elderly woman is not the right way to resolve problems from the past," he said, keeping his voice firm but respectful. "If you want to talk about the situation, we can go down to the office and discuss everything in a civilized manner, but I won't allow anyone to be intimidated or threatened under my roof." James laughed bitterly, a sound that contained not a trace of humor, only decades of unresolved pain. "Civilized? Like how my father tried to resolve things in a civilized manner when this woman accused him of stealing her savings. Like how he tried to prove his innocence in a civilized way while losing his job, his reputation, and finally his will to live." His voice rose dangerously. "Don't talk to me about civility when you're protecting the person who murdered my father with poisonous lies." Susan finally found her voice, though it came out as a broken whisper that could barely be heard above James's heavy breathing. "James, I remember you when you were just a boy, a sweet little boy who played in your yard while I walked by with my groceries. I remember your father, a hard-working and honest man who always greeted me respectfully." Tears began to flow freely down her cheeks as she continued, forcing herself to face the reality of the damage she had caused. "I know my words cannot bring your father back or undo the suffering I caused your family, but I need you to know that I was sick when I made those accusations." Her voice gained a little more strength. "I truly believed I was telling the truth at the time. My confused mind had created an alternative reality where you were the villains, but now I know that I was the only villain in the story." James took a threatening step toward Susan, his fists closing involuntarily, but Michael immediately placed himself between them, his posture making it clear he would not allow physical violence. "Sick?" James shouted, his voice echoing through the corridors of the mansion. "Were you sick when you dragged my family to court? Were you sick when you invented elaborate stories about how my father had stolen your jewelry and savings? Were you sick when you sat in front of the judge and swore you saw my father enter your house during the night?" His breathing was rapid, and Michael could see the man was fighting against violent impulses. "My father lost his job as an accountant because nobody trusted him anymore after your accusations. He lost all his clients, had to sell our house to pay the lawyers, and in the end we discovered you had just forgotten where you kept your things because of your dementia." He paused, swallowing with difficulty. "But worst of all was that when the truth finally came out, you had already been institutionalized and never apologized, never tried to make amends. And my father couldn't live with the humiliation and shame." The silence that followed James's revelation was deafening, broken only by Susan's silent sobs and the heavy breathing of everyone present. Michael felt as if he had been hit by a hammer, finally understanding the true extent of the tragedy Susan had caused during her episodes of early dementia. The idea that an innocent man had taken his own life because of false accusations was almost impossible to process, and he looked at Susan with a mixture of compassion and horror. Catherine, who had remained silent until then, took a faltering step forward, her hands extended, trying to find support on the wall. "Mr. Johnson," she said with a trembling but determined voice, "I understand your pain and your anger, and I cannot imagine what it must have been like to lose your father in such a terrible way." She took a deep breath before continuing. "But I can tell you one thing about suffering. It can make us better people or worse people, and the choice is ours." James turned to Catherine with surprise, clearly not expecting a blind young woman to get involved in the discussion, and his expression softened slightly upon realizing the vulnerability and courage of the girl. "Girl, you don't understand the situation. This woman is not an innocent victim who deserves compassion. She is a destroyer of lives who never paid for the harm she did," he said, trying to maintain his anger, but something in Catherine's presence was clearly affecting his determination. Catherine slowly shook her head, her words coming out with a maturity that surprised even her own father. "I understand more than you think. 3 years ago, I lost my sight and my mother in a car accident that could have been avoided. For a long time, I blamed my father, blamed the other driver, blamed God, and that anger was eating me up inside like poison." She paused, finding strength in her own words. "My father taught me that everyone deserves a second chance, including myself, because holding grudges and thirst for revenge only hurts us more." Catherine's brave statement created a palpable shift in the hallway's atmosphere, and James seemed genuinely touched by the wisdom and compassion of the young woman who had suffered her own devastating losses. He looked alternately at Catherine, Michael, and Susan, his initial anger beginning to be replaced by something that resembled painful reflection. "So you're lucky to have a father who taught you about forgiveness," he finally said, his voice losing some of its previous intensity. "My father never had the chance to teach me those lessons because this woman took him from me before I was ready to be an orphan." He pointed at Susan again, but the gesture no longer carried the same threat as before. "But maybe you're right about one thing. Carrying this anger for 15 years hasn't brought my father back, nor given me the peace I thought I'd find by confronting her." His voice broke slightly. "It only turned me into a bitter man who spends more time thinking about the past than building a future." Michael seized James's moment of vulnerability to try to find a solution that could satisfy the man's need for justice without compromising Susan's safety. "James, I know I can't bring your father back or undo the suffering your family went through, but perhaps we can find a way to honor his memory that doesn't involve more vengeance or pain," he carefully suggested. "Susan is clearly remorseful for what she did, and although that doesn't excuse her past actions, perhaps it's time to consider that she too was a victim of her own mental illness." He gently gestured toward the elderly woman, who continued to cry silently. "If you wish, I can ensure that Susan receives proper medical and psychological support, and that she participates in some kind of community reparation program." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "But threatening her or turning her over to the authorities without a constructive plan won't bring the peace you're looking for." James remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the floor as he processed Michael and Catherine's words. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his expression. No longer the blind anger from before, but a deep sadness mixed with a kind of emotional exhaustion. "You know what's most ironic about this whole situation?" he asked, his voice now laden with melancholy instead of fury. "My father always told me that revenge was a poison that poisoned the drinker, not the one who deserved it. He would have been disappointed in me for spending 15 years of my life pursuing a sick woman instead of using that time to do something positive in his memory." He looked directly at Susan, who had finally raised her eyes to face him. "But you need to understand one thing, Susan Williams. If you cause any kind of trouble again, if you hurt this family that has taken you in, or if you return to your old habits of creating drama and confusion, I will be back." His voice gained strength again. "And next time there won't be a wise young woman to remind me about forgiveness and second chances." Susan nodded vigorously, her tears now mixing gratitude with the relief of having been spared the retribution she had feared for so long. "James, I promise by everything sacred that I will use the time I have left in life to try to repair somehow the harm I caused. I know I can't bring your father back, but I swear I will never knowingly cause pain to anyone again," she said, her voice gaining a determination she hadn't shown before. "If this generous family gives me a chance to prove I've changed, I will use every day to show that I am worthy of their trust." She looked at Michael with deep gratitude. "And I promise that if my mind starts to fail again, if I start getting confused or creating problems, I will ask for help immediately, instead of letting the situation deteriorate as it did before." Her words carried the weight of a solemn oath. "The last thing I want is to cause more suffering to innocent people like you, who have shown me kindness when I needed it most." Michael observed the transformation that had occurred in everyone present during that intense emotional confrontation, and realized he was witnessing a moment of collective healing that was rare and precious. James had found a way to honor his father's memory through forgiveness rather than vengeance. Catherine had demonstrated a maturity and compassion that surpassed her age and her own tragedies, and Susan had finally faced the consequences of her past actions with genuine responsibility. "Margaret," he called toward the staircase, knowing the housekeeper was observing everything from the lower floor. "Could you come up, please? We need to have a family conversation about our next steps." He knew this was the most important decision he had made since the accident, and that its consequences would affect not only his own life, but the lives of everyone in the house. "James, I'd like you to know that your family will always be welcome in this house, and if you ever want to visit Susan or check how she's adapting, our door will always be open." Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, her expression revealing she had heard the entire conversation and was processing the emotional implications of everything that had occurred. When she reached the top of the staircase, she looked at each person present with an expression that mixed resignation, concern, and something that could be the beginning of a renewed understanding. "Mr. Michael, I heard everything that was said here, and although my opinion about Susan hasn't completely changed, I recognize that perhaps I'm allowing my prejudices from the past to cloud my judgment about the present," she admitted with difficulty. "If you truly believe you can give this woman a second chance, and if she is really willing to prove she has changed, then perhaps I can try to put my personal feelings aside." She looked directly at Susan with an expression still cautious. "But I want to make one thing very clear. If there is any sign that the old patterns are returning, if she starts creating problems or confusion, I won't hesitate to protect this family, even if it means confronting you, Mr. Michael." Michael felt a wave of relief upon realizing that Margaret was willing to reconsider her position, even with understandable reservations. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to completely trust Susan immediately, just to give me a week to properly assess the situation. If after that period you still feel uncomfortable, I will completely respect your decision," he proposed, hoping to find a middle ground that would allow everyone to gradually adjust to the new reality. "Susan will be under my personal responsibility, and I commit to monitoring any sign of problems or deterioration." He looked at each person present, realizing he was making a commitment that could fundamentally change the dynamics of his home. "A week is enough time to determine if this situation can work for everyone involved." Margaret sighed deeply, clearly struggling between her 15 years of loyalty to the family and her personal convictions about Susan. "A week, then, but with the condition that at the first sign of trouble, she leaves immediately, without discussions or additional second chances." James observed the negotiation with a thoughtful expression, clearly impressed by the mature way the family was handling such a complex and emotionally charged situation. "You are better people than I expected to find when I entered this house with so much anger," he admitted, extending his hand to Michael in a demonstration of mutual respect. "Perhaps my father was right when he always said that genuine kindness was more powerful than severe justice." He shook Michael's hand firmly, sealing a tacit agreement to give forgiveness a chance instead of insisting on punishment. "I'll leave my phone number with you, and I'd like you to keep me informed about how Susan is adapting." His voice gained a tone of respectful warning. "Not because I'm expecting her to fail, but because I want to make sure that good people like you won't be harmed by misguided generosity." He looked at Susan one last time. "Use this second chance well, ma'am. It has cost many people dearly." After James departed, leaving a card with his phone number and a feeling of cautious resolution in the air, the family regrouped in the living room to process everything that had happened on that extraordinary night. Susan seemed smaller in her wheelchair, as if the confrontation with her past had physically shrunk her, but there was also something different in her posture. A kind of relief for finally having faced the consequences of her actions. Catherine, still energized by the courage she had shown in defending Susan, held the elderly woman's hand with a tenderness that surprised everyone. "Susan, I want you to know that what happened before doesn't change how I feel about your presence here. We all make mistakes, some bigger than others, but what matters is what we do from now on," she said with conviction. "You promised to teach me to see again, and I want to learn no matter how difficult the path may be." Susan squeezed Catherine's hand with gratitude, her tears now of hope instead of despair. "Dear girl, I promise I will be worthy of your trust and your family's generosity." The night progressed with everyone trying to process the intense emotions of the confrontation, and gradually the house quieted down as each person retired to their rooms to rest and reflect on the extraordinary events of the day. Michael helped Susan settle into the guest room that Margaret had reluctantly prepared, ensuring she had everything she needed for a comfortable night. Catherine, for the first time in months, asked Margaret to help her take a bath and change clothes, demonstrating a renewed willingness to accept help when necessary. Margaret, still processing her own conflicting emotions, performed her usual tasks efficiently, but there was a noticeable tension in her movements, suggesting that true adaptation would take time. "Good night, Susan," said Michael as he left the elderly woman's room. "I hope you can rest after everything that happened today." Susan smiled weakly. "Thank you, Michael. This is the first time in years I'll sleep with hope in my heart." A few hours later, when the mansion was enveloped in the deep quietness of early morning, Michael was awakened by strange sounds coming from somewhere in the house. They were muffled noises, as if someone was moving heavy objects or dragging something across the floor, accompanied by occasional low moans that could be of pain or effort. Initially, he thought it might be Catherine trying to move around her room, but the sounds clearly came from a different direction, from the garage area at the back of the house. Michael got up silently, put on a robe and grabbed a baseball bat he kept beside the bed since the accident, a precaution Ellen had always found excessive, but which now gave him some comfort. He went down the stairs carefully, avoiding the steps that creaked, and followed the sounds to the door leading to the garage. If it's a thief, they're in for an unpleasant surprise, he thought, gripping the bat firmly. But if it's Susan doing something she shouldn't, then Margaret was right about me being too naive. When Michael carefully opened the garage door and peeked through the crack, the scene he found left him completely paralyzed. Susan was in her wheelchair in the center of the space, surrounded by old dust-covered boxes that had clearly been stored there for years. She was crying silently, holding something small in her trembling hands, and scattered on the floor around her were dozens of small clay sculptures of various shapes and sizes. All the pieces had one characteristic in common that made Michael's heart tighten. They all represented human figures with closed eyes, as if they were sleeping or in a state of eternal peace. Some were detailed faces, others whole figures in contemplative poses, but each one conveyed a sense of loss and melancholy that was almost palpable in the air of the silent garage. "My God," Michael whispered to himself, realizing that he was looking at evidence of an artistic and emotional depth in Susan that he had never suspected. These are true works of art, created by someone with extraordinary talent and profound pain. Michael gently turned on the garage light, making Susan start and quickly try to hide the small sculpture she was holding, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. Her cheeks were wet with tears, and her eyes carried a sadness so deep that Michael felt as if he was looking directly into the woman's wounded soul. "Susan, it's okay. You don't need to hide or be afraid," he said softly, putting the baseball bat aside and slowly approaching so as not to frighten her further. "Are these sculptures yours? Did you make them?" Susan nodded slowly, her voice coming out as a whisper laden with shame and pain. "I found these old boxes here in the garage and recognized my old work. I thought everything had been lost when my family sold my possessions, but apparently some pieces survived and were stored here by mistake." She looked at the scattered sculptures as if she were seeing ghosts from a past she preferred to forget. "I haven't forgotten how I became the terrible person who destroyed innocent lives. I just pretended to forget, because the pain of remembering was too great to bear." Susan remained silent for a long moment after her confession, her fingers gently caressing the small sculpture she held, as if it were the most precious object in the world. Michael moved even closer, observing the dozens of figures scattered across the garage floor, each revealing a level of artistic mastery that left him both impressed and moved. The soft light in the garage created dramatic shadows on the small works of art, making the sculpted faces appear even more melancholic and expressive. Susan finally raised her eyes to meet Michael's understanding gaze, and when she spoke, her voice carried decades of repressed pain that was finally finding an escape valve. "I was Susan Williams, the most respected sculptor in the region 25 years ago. My works were in important galleries. Collectors paid fortunes for a piece signed by me, and I thought my art would be my eternal legacy to the world." She paused, looking at her arthritic hands that still retained the memory of creating beauty. "But I discovered that the true legacy I left was pain and destruction, and that became heavier than any artistic success I ever achieved." Michael knelt among the sculptures, examining each piece with the respect they deserved, realizing he was in the presence of an artistic treasure that had been forgotten and abandoned like its creator. "Susan, these works are extraordinary. I can feel the emotion and talent in every curve, in every carefully molded detail. Why do they all have closed eyes?" he asked, genuinely curious about the meaning behind the recurring theme. Susan sighed deeply, as if preparing to reveal the most painful secret of her soul, and her response came laden with a maternal sadness that touched Michael's heart in an unexpected way. "Because they all represent my daughter Ellen, who was born blind and died at 21 from pneumonia that I couldn't prevent. For 15 years after her death, every sculpture I made was an attempt to preserve her memory, to keep alive the face I loved more than my own life." Her tears fell on the small figure she held. "The closed eyes were the only way I knew to represent someone who could never see the world, but who saw things that we, who can see, never managed to perceive." The revelation about Susan's lost daughter created an instant and deep connection between her and Michael, who suddenly understood the dimension of suffering that had shaped the elderly woman's life. "Susan, I now understand why you connected so quickly with Catherine. You recognized your own daughter in her, and perhaps saw an opportunity to channel all the maternal love you could no longer express," he said, his voice loaded with understanding and compassion. "These sculptures aren't just art. They're love letters to your daughter, each one a way of keeping the connection between you alive." Susan nodded vigorously, as if finally someone understood the true meaning of her artistic work, and continued her narrative with a brutal honesty that was simultaneously painful and liberating. "When I started having episodes of mental confusion and ended up making those terrible accusations against innocent families, I completely distanced myself from art because I felt I no longer deserved to create beauty after causing so much ugliness in the world." She looked directly into Michael's eyes. "I thought my punishment should be to deprive myself of the only thing that gave me purpose and joy, but now I realize that was just another way of slowly destroying myself." Michael remained kneeling among the sculptures for several minutes, absorbing not only Susan's story, but also glimpsing a possibility that could transform everyone's life in the house. "Susan, I have a proposal for you. What if we transform part of this garage into a proper studio where you can return to sculpting and perhaps teach Catherine about art through touch?" he suggested, observing how the elderly woman's eyes lit up with a spark of hope that hadn't appeared in years. "Catherine needs to find a way to express herself and connect with the world again, and you need to rediscover the purpose and joy that art always brought to your life." The proposal seemed to energize Susan in a way Michael hadn't seen before, as if she were rediscovering an essential part of herself that had been buried under layers of guilt and self-recrimination. "Do you really believe I can still teach something valuable to someone, especially to a young woman as special as Catherine?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and insecurity. "Because if you give me this opportunity, I promise I'll use each day to prove that I can still be a positive force in your lives." During the following days, Michael organized the transformation of a section of the garage into an improvised but functional studio, with suitable tables for working with clay, sculpting tools he bought especially for the project, and appropriate lighting that would allow both Susan and Catherine to work comfortably. Susan observed each preparation with growing emotion, her hands trembling slightly whenever she touched a familiar tool or smelled the characteristic scent of fresh clay that Michael had acquired. "It's been 5 years since I've touched real clay. 5 years since I felt this texture between my fingers or breathed in this aroma that always calmed me," she murmured while preparing her first block of material in a long time. "It's like rediscovering a lost part of my soul, a part I thought had died along with my ability to create without causing harm." When Catherine was finally introduced to the studio, her initial reaction was curiosity, mixed with hesitation, as if she too could feel the symbolic importance of that space. "Susan, do you really think I can learn to make something beautiful even without being able to see what I'm creating?" she asked, carefully touching the clay for the first time. "Dear, true art comes from the heart and hands, not from the eyes. Your blindness might even be an advantage, because you won't be influenced by visual expectations and will be able to create pure forms that come directly from your soul." The first days of work in the studio were marked by Catherine's typical resistance, who had grown accustomed to rejecting any new activity as a way to protect herself from more disappointment and frustration. She arrived at the studio with obvious reluctance, sat before the clay with a body posture that communicated disinterest, and frequently purposely broke the pieces she started to form whenever she felt they weren't turning out as she imagined. "This is useless. I can't make anything worthwhile," she shouted one particularly difficult afternoon, after smashing with her fist a small figure that had begun to take shape. "How can I create something beautiful if I don't even know what my own creations look like?" Susan observed these outbursts of frustration with infinite patience, never showing irritation or disappointment, simply silently cleaning up the remains of the destroyed clay and preparing a new block for Catherine to start over. "Dear, when my daughter Ellen was little and got frustrated because she couldn't see things that other children described, I used to tell her that her hands were her special eyes, capable of seeing textures, shapes, and emotions that ordinary eyes couldn't capture," Susan would say in a soft voice after each episode of anger. "Art isn't about visual perfection, it's about expressing what we feel inside, and you have very deep feelings waiting to be molded into something tangible." Margaret observed the first days of the studio from a distance, maintaining her physical and emotional distance as she had promised, but Michael could perceive that she was genuinely curious about the progress of the sessions between Susan and Catherine. The housekeeper made a point of passing by the garage several times a day, always with a practical excuse, like fetching something stored there or checking the cleanliness, but her eyes invariably turned to the pair working with clay. "Mr. Michael, I admit I'm surprised by the patience Susan shows with Catherine," she commented during one of her discreet rounds. "I expected her to lose patience quickly when Catherine began breaking the pieces, but she just keeps teaching as if nothing happened." Michael smiled, realizing that Margaret was gradually recognizing positive qualities in Susan despite her initial reservations. Perhaps Susan understands better than anyone what it means to deal with frustrations and feelings of inadequacy. She herself has broken many things in her life, so she knows how important it is to have someone who doesn't give up on you, even when you give up on yourself. The gradual transformation in the dynamic between Susan and Catherine began to manifest after the first week of working together, when the young woman finally managed to complete a small piece without destroying it in a burst of frustration. It was a simple and abstract form, more an expression of emotion than a specific representation, but it represented a significant milestone in her process of accepting the new reality. "Susan, I did it. I made something and didn't break it," exclaimed Catherine with a genuine joy she hadn't shown in a long time, her hands running over the smooth surface of the small sculpture as if reading emotional braille. Susan smiled with tears in her eyes, realizing she had managed to convey to Catherine something that no therapist or teacher had been able to, the feeling of achievement and self-efficacy that comes from creating something with your own hands. "Congratulations, dear. This is a beautiful piece because it carries your essence, your determination, and your courage. It doesn't matter how it looks visually. What matters is that you put your heart into it and didn't give up even when it was difficult." She gently touched Catherine's hand. "This is just the first of many wonderful creations you're going to make, because now you've discovered that your hands have the power to create beauty regardless of your eyes. During the second week, Catherine's progress accelerated remarkably, as if an internal barrier had finally been broken and she could finally access a creative part of herself that had been suppressed by the sadness and frustration of recent years. Her pieces began to gain more complexity and expressiveness, and she developed a particular technique of using her fingertips to create delicate textures that gave life to her creations. Susan observed this development with maternal pride, offering technical guidance when necessary, but mainly serving as an encouraging presence that allowed Catherine to explore her own creativity without fear of judgment. Catherine, you're developing a unique style that is completely your own. Your textures are different from anything I've seen in decades of sculpting, Susan said one afternoon when Catherine had just finished a particularly expressive piece. You're proving that physical limitations can actually release forms of creativity that people without these limitations never discover. Catherine smiled, an expression of contentment that Michael hadn't seen in years. Susan, for the first time since the accident, I feel like I'm good at something new. I'm not trying to go back to who I was before. I'm discovering who I can become now. It was at the end of the second week that Catherine created her first truly impressive piece. A small and delicate bird, but completely without wings, just the rounded body and head tilted in a posture suggesting both vulnerability and dignity. The absence of wings was so deliberate and striking that when Michael saw the piece for the first time, he was genuinely moved by the symbolic depth his daughter had managed to express through clay. Catherine, this sculpture is extraordinary. May I ask why you chose to make a bird without wings? He asked, carefully holding the small creation and admiring the smoothness of the curves and the expressiveness of the pose. Catherine was silent for a moment, as if organizing deep thoughts before articulating them, and when she answered, her words carried a wisdom that surprised even Susan. Because I haven't learned to fly yet, Dad. This bird is me now, still bound to the ground, still learning to navigate the world without sight but no longer broken. She paused, gently touching her creation. One day, when I'm truly ready, I'll make another bird, and that one will have the most beautiful wings I can create, because it will represent who I've become after learning to fly in a completely new way. The profound symbolism of Catherine's sculpture deeply touched not only Michael and Susan, but also Margaret, who had observed the creation of the piece from afar and been genuinely impressed by the emotional maturity the young woman had demonstrated through her art. That night, after Catherine had gone to bed, Margaret finally approached Susan in the studio, where the older woman was organizing tools and preparing fresh clay for the next day's session. Susan, Margaret said hesitantly, clearly struggling with her own emotions and prejudices, I need to admit that I was wrong about you, at least in part. Susan stopped what she was doing and turned to face the housekeeper, surprised by the unexpected approach but prepared to hear anything Margaret wanted to say. I've observed how you work with Catherine, how you have infinite patience with her frustrations, how you've managed to awaken something in her that all of us have tried to do for 3 years without success, continued Margaret, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Perhaps I've allowed my anger about the past to prevent me from seeing that people can truly change, and that the mistakes we make when we're sick don't define who we are when we're healthy. She extended her hand to Susan as a peace offering. I apologize for judging you so harshly, and I would like to try to restart our relationship based on who you are now, not who you were when you were confused. Susan accepted Margaret's outstretched hand with tears of gratitude running down her cheeks, realizing that she had finally managed to earn the trust of the most protective person in the family that had taken her in. Margaret, you don't need to apologize for being cautious. You are protecting a family you love, and that is admirable and understandable, Susan replied sincerely. I know I still have a lot to prove, and that trust is built with consistent actions over time, not with pretty words. She firmly shook Margaret's hand. I promise I will continue working every day to be worthy of the second chance this family has given me, and I hope that with time we can develop a true friendship based on mutual respect and shared love for Catherine and Michael. Margaret nodded, a small smile appearing on her face for the first time since Susan's arrival. I think that's possible, especially if you continue making Catherine smile the way you have been these past few weeks. Seeing that girl happy again is worth more than any past grudges I might carry." The following weeks brought a remarkable transformation in the house's dynamics, with Catherine spending more and more time in the studio and showing an enthusiasm for life that had been absent since the accident. Susan flourished equally, rediscovering her purpose through teaching and returning to create her own pieces with a renewed passion that seemed to physically rejuvenate her. Michael observed these changes with growing joy, realizing that his impulsive decision to help a stranger in a storm had transformed into an unexpected blessing for the entire family. Margaret, for her part, had become a genuine ally to Susan, often bringing tea and biscuits to the studio and even offering practical suggestions to improve the workspace. "It's as if the whole house has awakened from a deep sleep," Michael commented one night as he watched Catherine and Susan work together on a new piece. "There is laughter in the hallways again, there is purpose in our days, and there is hope for the future." Susan smiled, her hands shaping clay with the mastery of decades of experience. "Sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the most difficult moments, Michael. Catherine has taught me that, as much as I have taught her." 3 weeks after the sessions in the studio began, Michael decided to leave work early to surprise Catherine and Susan, buying new materials and perhaps taking them out to dinner as a way to celebrate the extraordinary progress they had achieved together. He arrived home with a light heart and a smile on his face, carrying bags with specialized tools and different types of clay that he had specifically researched to expand the creative possibilities of the improvised studio. When he approached the garage, he could hear sounds that made him stop abruptly. Catherine was laughing loudly, a genuine and carefree sound he hadn't heard in years, accompanied by Susan's caring voice offering guidance and encouragement. "That's right, dear. Feel the texture change as you press, more or less. The clay will tell you what it wants to become," Susan said with evident joy in her voice. "You're creating something truly special today." Michael quietly approached the studio entrance, wanting to observe the moment without interrupting it, and the scene he found left him completely paralyzed with emotion. Catherine was standing, something she had avoided doing for long periods since the accident, completely covered in wet clay that stained her clothes and hands, but with an expression of concentration and joy that completely transformed her appearance. She was working on a complex and detailed sculpture that was positioned on a central table in the studio, her hands moving with confidence and precision over the clay while Susan verbally guided her on advanced techniques. But it wasn't even Catherine's confident posture or her obvious joy that shocked Michael. It was the piece she was working on, a sculpture of a female face so detailed and precise that it seemed impossible to have been created by someone who couldn't see what she was doing. When Michael looked more carefully, his heart almost stopped as he recognized the familiar, delicate features. It was the face of Ellen, his deceased wife, recreated purely through Catherine's tactile and emotional memory with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. "Mom," Michael whispered to himself, tears beginning to run down his face. "Catherine is sculpting her mother's face as if she could see her again." Michael remained still, observing his daughter work with a mastery that seemed impossible for someone so young and inexperienced, but which clearly came from a much deeper place than technique. It came from love and longing transformed into art through Susan's patient guidance. "Susan, I feel it's almost finished. Are the proportions correct? Is the expression capturing what I want to convey?" asked Catherine, her hands making final adjustments to the most delicate details of the sculpted face. Susan observed the piece with tears in her own eyes, clearly moved by the extraordinary skill Catherine had developed and by the emotional choice to recreate her lost mother. "Dear, this is the most beautiful sculpture I've seen in my entire career. You've captured not just the physical features but also the essence, the love, the kindness that I bet your mother radiated." She gently touched Catherine's shoulder. "Your mother would be proud not only of the art you've created, but of the strong and talented woman you're becoming." Michael was about to enter the studio to hug his daughter and express his admiration for the extraordinary achievement when his phone rang, breaking the magical moment with an urgency that he immediately felt would be problematic. Michael's phone vibrated insistently in his hand while he observed, paralyzed by emotion. his daughter putting the finishing touches on the most extraordinary sculpture he had ever seen. The voice on the other end of the line sounded official and urgent, completely breaking the magical moment he was witnessing in the studio. "Mr. Matthews, this is from the administration of St. Francis Home. We need to talk about Ms. Susan Williams, who is under your temporary care. Her family showed up here today demanding information about her whereabouts, and we have a delicate legal situation that needs to be resolved immediately." Michael felt his stomach tighten as he listened to the words that he knew would change everything again, destroying the peace and progress they had achieved in recent weeks. "They are coming there now, accompanied by a social worker, and insist that Ms. Susan must return to the shelter immediately. Apparently there are legal issues about guardianship and responsibility that need to be clarified." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of reality falling on him like a mountain. "Thank you for the warning. We will be prepared to receive them." Michael hung up the phone and remained for a moment, watching Catherine finalize the sculpture of Ellen's face, knowing that he needed to interrupt that perfect moment with news that would devastate both his daughter and Susan. He quietly entered the studio, and when Catherine heard his footsteps, she turned with a radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "Dad, you arrived at the perfect time. I just finished the sculpture of Mom, and Susan says it's perfect. I want you to be the first to see it, and tell me if I managed to capture her essence the way you remember." Her voice was full of pride and expectation, and Michael felt his heart shatter, knowing that in a few minutes he would have to destroy that joy with the cruel reality of Susan's legal situation. "Catherine, dear, the sculpture is absolutely perfect. You managed to capture not just your mother's face, but also her gentle and loving soul," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotion that overwhelmed him. "But we need to talk about something important that just came up. Susan's family is coming here, and they want to take her back." Catherine's expression instantly changed from joy to absolute panic, and she instinctively clutched Susan's arm as if she could physically prevent her from leaving. "No, they can't take Susan away. She can't go, Dad. She's all I have now. She taught me to see again," Catherine shouted, her words coming out broken by the emotion that dominated her. Susan felt Catherine's desperation and immediately tried to comfort her, although her own emotions were in complete turmoil upon learning that her new family was about to be destroyed. "Catherine, dear, maybe it's better this way. Maybe I've stayed too long, taken too much advantage of your kindness," said Susan, trying to sound calm despite the tears that began to run down her cheeks. "My granddaughter has the legal right to make decisions about my life, and maybe she's right in wanting to take me back to where I belong." But even as she spoke these words, Susan knew she didn't want to leave, that she had found in Michael and Catherine the family she had always wished to have again. "The problem is that my heart doesn't want to leave, because for the first time in years I feel useful, loved and with purpose." 20 minutes later, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house with an urgency that made everyone startle, announcing the arrival of the people who would decide Susan's fate. Michael opened the door to find two women, a young woman of approximately 30 years old with facial features that vaguely resembled Susan's, but with a tense and determined expression, and an older woman wearing professional clothes and carrying a folder that clearly identified her as a social worker. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Jessica Johnson, Susan Williams' granddaughter, and this is the social worker responsible for my grandmother's case," said the young woman, extending her hand in a formality that didn't hide her obvious irritation. "We need to talk about the irregular situation my grandmother is in, and immediately resolve her return to the care facility where she should be receiving adequate care." Michael shook the offered hand, but could feel the hostility behind the courteous gesture, and immediately realized that he was dealing with someone who had arrived with decisions already made. "Welcome to my home. Susan is in the living room with my daughter. Perhaps we should sit down and talk about the situation calmly before making any hasty decisions." He gestured toward the living room, trying to maintain a diplomatic tone. "I'm sure we all want what's best for Susan." Jessica followed Michael to the living room with determined steps, her body posture communicating a mixture of unresolved guilt and defensive determination that Michael immediately recognized as the attitude of someone trying to correct a past mistake through impulsive action. When she saw Susan sitting next to Catherine, both still with clay remnants on their hands, and expressions of happiness that contrasted drastically with the tension that now filled the environment. Her expression softened momentarily before hardening again. "Grandma Susan," said Jessica, her voice trembling slightly with repressed emotion, "I've come to take you back home, to where you should be receiving the proper care you need." Susan looked up at her granddaughter, with an expression that mixed love, sadness, and a resignation that broke Michael's heart, as if she already knew this battle was lost before it even began. "Jessica, my dear granddaughter, you've grown so much since the last time I saw you. How is your life? How is your work?" asked Susan, trying to establish a personal connection before facing the difficult issues. "I was doing well here, learning and teaching, feeling useful again, but if you believe I should go back, then perhaps that's what should happen." The social worker observed the family interaction with professional eyes, trained to identify problematic dynamics, and Michael could feel that she was evaluating not just Susan's situation, but also the suitability of his home as a temporary environment for a vulnerable elderly person. "Mr. Matthews, while I admire your generosity in welcoming Miss Susan during her emergency, there are legal protocols and liability issues that need to be considered," she said, taking papers from her folder and placing them on the coffee table. "Ms. Susan is a person under partial guardianship due to her condition of early dementia, and her granddaughter Jessica has legal responsibility for her care and housing decisions." She looked around the room, clearly evaluating the environment. "Additionally, there is the question of the suitability of a home run by a single man as a care environment for an elderly woman who needs specialized supervision." Michael felt a wave of indignation upon hearing the insinuation about the inadequacy of his home. "Doctor, I can assure you that Susan has received all necessary care here and more love and attention than she probably received at the care facility." Jessica sat heavily in an armchair, as if the weight of guilt and responsibility was finally taking its emotional toll, and when she spoke, her voice carried years of unresolved regret that finally found an escape valve. "You don't understand the situation. I abandoned my grandmother 2 years ago because I was ashamed and guilty about the scandal she caused, the families that were harmed by her false accusations during her dementia episodes." She continued, revealing a deep pain that she had carried alone for a long time. "I was young starting my career and couldn't handle the social humiliation of having a grandmother who had been labeled a liar and problematic. So I made the cowardly decision to place her in the care home and completely distance myself from her life." She looked directly at Susan, who was watching her with compassion instead of accusation. "Now I realize I made a terrible mistake, that I abandoned someone who needed me the most, and I want to fix that by taking her back and caring for her properly." Her words revealed a motivation that was more about relieving her own guilt than about Susan's true well-being. "I can't live with the weight of knowing she's being cared for by strangers, while I, her only family, hide from responsibility." Susan listened to her granddaughter's painful confession with a mixture of understanding and sadness, realizing that Jessica was trying to correct a past mistake through an action that might not be in the best interest of anyone involved. "Jessica, dear, I understand your feelings and hold no grudge for your past decisions. You are young and dealing with an impossible situation that I created with my illness," Susan said in a soft voice, extending a trembling hand toward her granddaughter. "But you need to understand that these past weeks have been the happiest I've had in years. I've found purpose again. I'm helping Catherine discover her artistic talent, and I feel part of a true family for the first time since I lost my daughter, Ellen." She paused, choosing her words carefully not to hurt Jessica any further. "If you truly want what's best for me, perhaps you should consider that maybe I've already found where I belong, even if it's not where you expected it to be." Susan looked around the room, her eyes resting on Catherine, who held her hand with increasing strength. "Sometimes true family isn't determined by blood, but by love and mutual care." Catherine, who had remained silent during most of the conversation, finally found her voice and stood up with a determination that surprised everyone present. "Excuse me, but you're talking about Susan as if she were an object that can be moved from one place to another without considering her own feelings," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Susan is not just a legal responsibility or a way for you to alleviate your guilt. She is an extraordinary person who taught me to live again after 3 years of darkness." Tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice remained firm and determined. "She is the grandmother I never had, the mentor who changed my life, and the friend who showed me that art can heal wounds that medicine and therapy could never reach." Catherine turned toward where she knew Susan was sitting. "If you take her away, you won't just be destroying my chance to continue learning and growing. You'll be separating two people who found each other at the exact moment they needed each other the most." Her passionate statement created a tense silence in the room. "Susan chose me and I chose her, and that should mean something in your decision." Michael, deeply touched by his daughter's courageous statement, and realizing he needed to take a definitive position to protect the happiness that had been achieved with such effort, stood up and positioned himself near Susan in a clear demonstration of support. "Jessica, I understand the legal and family concerns involved in this situation, but I would like to propose a solution that might serve the interests of everyone involved," he said, his voice carrying determination and sincerity. "I am willing to legally adopt Susan as part of my family, assuming all legal and financial responsibilities for her care, ensuring she has access to the best medical care available, and providing an environment where she can continue to flourish as she has been doing." He looked directly into Jessica's eyes, trying to communicate the seriousness of his proposal. This would resolve the legal guardianship issues, ensure Susan receives proper care, and allow her to remain where she is clearly happy and positively contributing. Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "I know this may seem like a radical proposal from someone who has only known her for a few weeks, but sometimes the deepest connections happen quickly when the right people meet at the right time." Michael's proposal created an immediate and explosive reaction from Jessica, who abruptly rose from the armchair with an expression of indignation and disbelief that completely transformed her appearance. "This is absolutely unacceptable. You're trying to manipulate a vulnerable elderly woman who clearly isn't in a condition to make important decisions about her own life," she shouted, pointing accusingly at Michael. "You've known my grandmother for less than a month and already want to legally adopt her. This isn't kindness, it's emotional manipulation of someone who is desperate for affection and acceptance." Her voice rose even higher, filled with anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "I'm going to sue you for elder abuse, for manipulating a vulnerable person, and I'll make sure my grandmother is removed from this house immediately before you cause her more psychological damage." Jessica turned to the social worker with a desperate expression. "Doctor, surely you can see that this situation is completely inappropriate and potentially dangerous for my grandmother." Her accusations created a toxic atmosphere in the room. "This man is clearly taking advantage of an elderly woman's mental confusion to satisfy his own emotional needs." The doctor observed the emotional escalation of the discussion with a concerned expression, clearly perceiving that the situation was rapidly deteriorating and that she needed to intervene before it caused psychological damage to Susan, who was visibly distressed by the conflict around her. "Mr. Matthews, although your intentions may be genuine, I must agree with Ms. Jessica that the situation presents several irregularities that are concerning from a legal and ethical standpoint," she said, consulting her papers again. "The adoption of an elderly woman by an unknown family, especially in circumstances where she may be emotionally vulnerable, raises questions about manipulation and taking advantage of a person in a state of dependency." She looked around the room, assessing not only the physical adequacy of the environment, but also the complex emotional dynamics that were developing. Furthermore, there is the question of the suitability of a home environment managed by a single man for the care of an elderly woman who needs constant supervision and specialized care that only an appropriate institution can provide. Her professional assessment was clearly inclined toward Susan's removal. "I recommend that Ms. Susan return immediately to St. Francis Home, where she can receive adequate care while issues of permanent guardianship are resolved through appropriate legal channels." Susan, who had remained silent during the escalation of the conflict, began to show visible signs of extreme distress that Michael immediately recognized as the beginning of a severe anxiety episode. Her hands trembled violently, her breathing became irregular and shallow, and she began to rock back and forth in the chair, in a repetition of the behavior he had observed on the night he found her on the road. "No, I can't. I can't go back there. They don't understand. Nobody understands, but," she muttered, her words becoming increasingly incoherent as the mental confusion that accompanied her anxiety episodes began to manifest. "Catherine? Where is Catherine? I need to finish. I need to teach. She hasn't learned to fly yet." Her eyes moved frantically around the room, as if she could no longer properly process what was happening around her. The sight of Susan entering a state of mental confusion before everyone's eyes instantly validated the social worker's concerns about her ability to make independent decisions. "They're taking me away. Like before. Nobody asks what I want. Nobody cares." Her words came out between sobs. "I just want to stay with my family. I just want to help Catherine see again." Catherine, immediately realizing that Susan was entering a state of panic and confusion, tried to approach her for consolation, but her own emotions were so intense that she also began to enter a state of distress. "Susan, don't let them take you. You promised we would make more sculptures together. You promised you would teach me to make wings for my bird," shouted Catherine, her words coming out mixed with tears of despair. "I can't lose you too. I've already lost my mother. I've already lost my sight. I can't lose the only person who taught me that I can still be happy anyway." She tried to find Susan in the space, her hands extended seeking physical contact that could offer comfort to both. "Dad, do something. Don't let them destroy our family." Catherine began to cry uncontrollably, her fear of abandonment being traumatically triggered by the possibility of losing Susan. "Please, Susan, fight for us. Tell them you want to stay. Tell them we're your true family now." Catherine's panic intensified Susan's state of confusion even more. "Don't leave me alone in the darkness again." Michael found himself in an impossible position, watching two people he loved simultaneously enter states of extreme anguish while facing legal threats that could destroy everything they had built together in recent weeks. "Jessica, doctor, please look at what you're doing. Susan wasn't confused until you arrived here with threats and ultimatums," he said, trying to control his own frustration and fear as he moved between Susan and Catherine, trying to calm both. She was perfectly lucid, creative and happy until this moment. The stress of this situation is causing a regression that only proves that tearing her away from this environment where she feels safe is exactly the wrong thing to do. He knelt beside Susan, trying to establish eye contact to help her focus and calm down. "Susan, breathe with me, you're safe. Catherine is here, I'm here, and we won't let anything bad happen to you." But even as he offered words of comfort, Michael knew that the legal situation was rapidly slipping out of his control and that he might not have the power to fulfill his promises. "I need to find a quick legal solution, or I'll lose Susan and watch Catherine fall apart again." It was in this moment of absolute crisis that something completely unexpected happened. Susan, amid her mental confusion and emotional distress, suddenly rose from the wheelchair, staggering slightly but clearly standing by her own strength. The movement was so sudden and unforeseen that it created a complete silence in the room, with everyone looking in absolute shock at the woman they had assumed to be permanently wheelchair-dependent. Susan took a few faltering steps, as if her body was remembering movements it hadn't practiced in a long time, her legs trembling under the weight of her body, but clearly functional and able to support her. I can walk," she muttered, seeming surprised by her own ability, as if she had temporarily forgotten that she had hidden this ability from everyone around her. Jessica and the doctor were dumbfounded, clearly shocked by the revelation that Susan had apparently lied about her physical disability, while Michael and Catherine were equally surprised, but also confused about why she had kept this secret. "Why? Why didn't you tell us you could walk?" asked Michael, his voice mixing relief with confusion. "Susan, why did you stay in the chair if you didn't need it?" Susan, still standing but visibly unstable both physically and emotionally, seemed to realize what she had revealed and immediately became even more distressed, as if she had involuntarily exposed a secret that left her even more vulnerable. She stumbled slightly, losing her balance as the realization of what she had done hit her hard, and was clearly about to fall when Catherine, guided only by the sound of her heavy breathing and the instinct to protect someone she loved, ran toward her and caught her perfectly at the exact moment. The two women fell together onto the sofa, embraced in a demonstration of connection and mutual care that was more eloquent than any legal argument that could be presented. Susan held Catherine tightly, as if she were her only anchor in an emotional storm, and whispered something in the young woman's ear that made fresh tears run down her cheeks. The moment of intimacy between them created an atmosphere charged with emotion that made even Jessica and the doctor fall silent, realizing that they were witnessing something profound and significant that transcended legal and bureaucratic issues. "What did she say, Catherine?" asked Jessica in a hesitant voice, clearly shaken by what she had witnessed. Catherine raised her tear-stained face, her voice trembling with emotion. "She said she's been able to walk for 6 months, but stayed in the chair because..." The silence in the living room was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of everyone present as they waited for Catherine to finish the revelation she had begun. Susan remained embraced with the young woman on the sofa, her tears falling silently, as she realized that her deepest secret was about to be exposed to everyone who might judge her even more severely. Catherine took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts to accurately convey the whispered words that Susan had shared in her moment of greatest vulnerability. She said she stayed in the chair because then people would pity her, not hate her. That if she pretended to be weaker than she really was, maybe people wouldn't expect her to go back to being the terrible person she was before. Catherine's voice trembled with emotion as she continued, revealing the depth of self-punishment Susan had imposed on herself. But now she has understood that pretending weakness doesn't erase the past, and that true strength comes from facing who we are and working to be better. Susan held Catherine even tighter against herself. She said I taught her that it's worth fighting for happiness, even when we think we don't deserve it. Susan slowly separated from Catherine, realizing the moment had come to face the complete truth before everyone who had gathered to decide her fate. Catherine is right about everything she said. 6 months ago, during physical therapy sessions at the shelter, I gradually recovered my ability to walk. But when the physical therapists discharged me and said I could be independent again, I felt absolute terror, she confessed, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. It wasn't fear of physical responsibility. It was fear that if people knew I was better, they would expect me to go back to being the Susan from before, the confident, independent, and respected woman who destroyed innocent lives with her sick delusions. She looked directly into Jessica's eyes, who watched her with an expression of growing shock. I preferred to pretend I was still invalid because I thought if people saw me as fragile and dependent, perhaps they would feel pity instead of anger, and I wouldn't have to face the expectation of being normal again. Her hands trembled as she continued. The wheelchair became my self-imposed prison, my way of punishing myself for the harm I had caused and avoiding the responsibility of trying to be better. Jessica slowly rose from the armchair, her legs trembling slightly as she processed her grandmother's devastating revelation, and walked to the window as if needing fresh air to breathe properly. "Grandma, are you telling me that during all these months when I felt guilty for abandoning you in a wheelchair, you were deliberately pretending to be more disabled than you really were?" she asked, her voice laden with a mixture of disbelief and deep pain. "You let me carry that additional guilt. Let me believe I was leaving someone completely dependent when in fact you were choosing to be dependent." Tears fell as the situation became clear. "This means my guilt for abandoning you was based on a lie you created to protect yourself, while I was destroying myself inside believing I had left a completely helpless person." Jessica turned to face Susan, and in her expression there was not just anger but also a painful understanding. "But now I understand that we were both doing the same thing, punishing ourselves for past mistakes instead of working to correct them. I distanced myself out of guilt and shame, and you confined yourself to a wheelchair for the same reason." The doctor observed the family dynamics unfold, with a professional expression that gradually gave way to something more human and understanding, realizing she was witnessing not just a legal resolution, but a deep emotional healing among people who had carried wounds for a long time. "Mrs. Susan, while I understand the psychological motivations behind your actions, I must say that pretending physical disability is a serious matter that affects not only legal care issues, but also the trust of people around you, she said, but her voice lacked the severity she had demonstrated earlier. However, I can also see that your self-punishment was a way of dealing with deep psychological trauma, and that the environment of this house clearly provided the emotional safety necessary for you to finally face the truth about yourself. She looked around the room, observing the genuine connections between all the people present. From a therapeutic standpoint, the progress you've demonstrated here in terms of emotional honesty and willingness for vulnerability is more significant than many formal treatments I've seen in my career. The social worker paused, clearly reconsidering her initial assessment. Perhaps we need to reconsider which environment truly offers the best care for your specific needs. It was in this moment of revelations and reconsiderations that the sound of the doorbell again interrupted the intense conversation, making everyone start and wonder who else might be arriving to complicate an already complex situation. Michael headed to the door with hesitant steps, still processing everything that had been revealed about Susan. And when he opened it, he found James standing outside with a serious but no longer hostile expression. "James, what brings you here again?" asked Michael, surprised by the unexpected second visit from the man who had confronted Susan weeks earlier. James looked beyond Michael toward the living room, where he could hear excited voices still conversing intensely. "I heard raised voices as I was passing by on the street and worried that Susan might be in some kind of trouble. I know it may seem strange, but since our previous conversation, I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness and second chances," he admitted, respectfully removing his hat. "I came here because I realized there were still unresolved issues in my heart, and I wanted to close this chapter in a way that truly honored my father's memory." His voice carried a serenity that wasn't present in their first meeting. "My father always said that revenge was a poison that poisoned the one who drank it, and I finally understood that he was right." Michael led James into the living room, where his presence initially created a palpable tension, especially in Jessica and the doctor, who didn't know who he was or why he was there. Susan saw him enter and immediately tried to stand up again, but James made a gentle gesture for her to remain seated, his body language communicating peace instead of the hostility he had previously shown. "Susan, I've come here not to confront you again, but to tell you something I should have said weeks ago," he said, slowly approaching and respectfully kneeling before her so they would be at the same level. "I forgive you. I completely forgive you for the mistakes you made when you were ill, for the difficulties you caused my family, and for the pain we carried for so many years." His words created a reverent silence in the room, and Susan began to cry again, but this time tears of relief and gratitude. "I didn't come here out of pity or because someone convinced me to forgive. I came because I realized that holding on to anger for 15 years hasn't brought my father back, but only prevented me from becoming the man he wanted me to be." James gently took Susan's hand. "I hope you can forgive yourself too, because my father would have been happy to know that you found a family that loves and values you." Jessica observed the interaction between James and Susan with an expression of profound recognition, realizing she was witnessing exactly the kind of forgiveness and acceptance that she herself was struggling to offer and receive. "Sir, I don't know who you are or what your history is with my grandmother, but your words make me realize that perhaps I've been fighting against the wrong people," she said, slowly approaching the group. "I spent 2 years hating myself for abandoning my grandmother, and now I discover that she spent the same time hating herself for past mistakes. We were both trapped in cycles of guilt that helped no one." She knelt beside James, creating an intimate circle around Susan that symbolized acceptance instead of judgment. "Grandma, I also need to ask for forgiveness, not just for abandoning you when you needed support the most, but for coming here today, trying to take you away because of my guilt, not your well-being." Tears flowed freely down her cheeks. "If you've truly found happiness and purpose here, then perhaps my role isn't to take you away, but to ensure you have the legal and family support to stay where you're happy." Jessica looked at Michael with an expression of growing gratitude. "Mr. Matthews, I apologize for the accusations I made. It's obvious that you genuinely love my grandmother." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over his body, as he realized that the situation was finally resolving in a way that could benefit everyone involved, especially Susan and Catherine, who had suffered emotionally throughout the confrontation. "Jessica, I completely understand your initial concerns and hold no resentment for the accusations. You were trying to protect your grandmother in the best way you knew how," he said, joining the circle that had formed around Susan. "But I'd like to propose a solution that might address everyone's needs. How about Susan stays here with us for 6 months, during which you can visit her whenever you want to make sure she's well cared for and happy?" He looked at the doctor, including her in the proposal. "During this period, she can receive regular monitoring from health professionals to ensure her medical needs are being met, and after 6 months, she can freely decide where she wants to live permanently." Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "If she decides to stay with us, we can formalize a legal adoption that gives her legal security, and you the peace of mind of knowing she has a family that loves her unconditionally." Catherine approached and held Susan's hand. "And if she decides to leave, we will respect her choice, but at least we will have given her time to make a decision based on clarity, not pressure or fear." The doctor observed the remarkable transformation that had occurred in the group dynamic during the last hour, recognizing that she was witnessing a genuine emotional resolution that she rarely saw in official cases. "Mr. Matthews, I must admit that my initial assessment of the situation was based on standard protocols and did not adequately take into account the obvious therapeutic benefits that Mrs. Susan has experienced in this environment," she said, consulting her notes one last time before closing them definitively. "The emotional and psychological progress she has demonstrated here, including her willingness to be vulnerable and honest about her limitations, is more significant than many formal treatments." She looked directly at Susan with a respectful expression. "I agree with the proposal of a 6-month trial period, subject to monthly monitoring by a social worker and regular medical evaluations to ensure that her needs are being met." The professional paused, smiling slightly for the first time since she arrived. "And I must say that it is rare to see such a genuine family resolution centered on the well-being of the person involved, rather than on legal issues or convenience." She extended her hand to Michael. "I will be in touch to organize the necessary follow-up, but I believe we have found a solution that honors both the legal and human needs of this unique situation." 6 months later, Michael's mansion was transformed into a scene of celebration and pride, with people circulating through the illuminated gardens while admiring tactile sculptures carefully arranged on special pedestals that allowed visitors with and without visual impairments to appreciate the works through touch. Catherine, wearing an elegant dress and with a radiant smile that lit up her entire face, walked confidently among the guests with Susan by her side, no longer in the wheelchair, but walking with renewed grace and dignity. The exhibition, Seeing with Other Eyes, had attracted art critics, educators, families with visual impairments, and community members who came to discover a new way of experiencing art. "Catherine, dear, I am so proud of you, and how you've transformed your pain into something that inspires and educates other people," said Susan, observing with satisfaction how her protégé interacted with growing confidence with the visitors. "Your sculptures are not just art. They are bridges that connect different worlds and show that beauty can be experienced in ways that go far beyond vision." Catherine smiled, gently touching one of her favorite pieces, the bird that now had magnificently detailed wings. "Susan, none of this would be possible without you. You taught me that limitations can become strengths when we learn to work with them instead of against them." Jessica circulated through the exhibition with an expression of genuine admiration and renewed pride for her grandmother, carefully photographing the interactions between Susan and Catherine and documenting an event that represented not only artistic achievement, but profound family healing. "Grandma, seeing you like this, confident and contributing to something so beautiful, makes me realize that my decision to support your stay here was the best I've ever made," she said, warmly embracing Susan. "You have not only found a new family, but rediscovered your purpose and joy of living." Susan returned the hug strongly, realizing that her relationship with Jessica had evolved into something more mature and mutually respectful. "Dear granddaughter, I've learned that true family is not just about blood, but about mutual choice and constant care. You, Michael, Catherine, and even Margaret have become my chosen family, and that is a gift I didn't expect to receive at 75. She looked around the exhibition with deep satisfaction. And you, by allowing me to stay where I am happy, have shown a truer love than family obligation could ever have demonstrated. Michael observed the exhibition from a corner of the garden, talking with James, who had become a regular visitor to the house and developed an unlikely but meaningful friendship with the entire family. James, thank you for coming today. I know that seeing Susan happy and thriving could be difficult, considering the history between you, said Michael, offering a glass of wine to the man who had become an unexpected ally. But your presence here today represents something beautiful about forgiveness and second chances. James observed Susan interacting with the guests, an expression of genuine peace on his face. Michael, seeing Susan like this gives me a sense of closure that I never thought would be possible. She clearly has become a different person from the one I knew in the past, wiser, more compassionate, and definitely more aware of the impact of her actions. He paused, watching Catherine explain one of her sculptures to a group of blind children. And the work she has done with Catherine proves that people can transform and use their past experiences, even the painful ones, to create something positive in the world. James smiled genuinely. My father would be proud to know that something good blossomed from so much suffering. Margaret circulated among the guests with trays of appetizers, her face radiating satisfaction at seeing the house full of joy and purpose again after years of melancholic silence. Mr. Michael, I never imagined when Susan arrived on that stormy night that she would become so integral to this family's happiness, she commented during a pause in her hostess duties. I admit I was completely wrong about her, and I feel grateful for having been forced to confront my prejudices. She observed Susan helping Catherine explain a particularly complex sculpture to a visitor. Seeing Catherine laughing and creating again, seeing the house full of life and art, makes me realize that sometimes the best things come from the most unlikely encounters. Michael nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction at seeing how all the elements of his life had harmonized in a way he could never have planned. Margaret, thank you for staying and giving Susan a chance. Your presence and eventual acceptance meant a lot to her, and your ability to change your opinion when you saw evidence of genuine change was a lesson for all of us. He observed his daughter confidently interacting with strangers. And thank you for taking care of Catherine during all these difficult years. She needed both of you for stability and practical care, and Susan for inspiration and creative purpose. As the night progressed and the last guest said goodbye with promises to return and bring friends interested in tactile art, the family gathered in the garage studio, now expanded and professionally equipped to accommodate both teaching and advanced artistic creation. Catherine and Susan worked side by side on a new series of sculptures that combined traditional techniques with tactile innovations that Catherine had developed, their laughter echoing through the space as they molded clay with hands covered in wet material. Susan, when I started working with clay, I never imagined that one day I would be teaching others and organizing exhibitions, said Catherine, her fingers creating delicate textures on a piece representing a human figure dancing. You gave me more than artistic technique. You gave me back my confidence and my purpose. Susan smiled, observing how Catherine had evolved from a broken and resistant young woman to a confident and inspiring artist. Catherine, dear, you taught me as much as I taught you. You showed that true strength comes not from hiding our wounds, but from transforming them into something that can help others facing similar challenges. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the sound of their tools creating a gentle symphony of creativity. And you taught me that true family is built through choice and daily care, not just through blood ties or obligation. Michael leaned against the entrance to the studio, watching the two women who had transformed his house into a true home again, and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun on a stormy night with a simple act of human compassion. Catherine's transformation from an isolated and bitter young woman into a confident and inspiring artist was miraculous, but equally impressive was Susan's evolution from a broken woman full of guilt into a wise mentor and a loving new grandmother. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had simply driven past that night in the forest, he murmured to himself, but loud enough for both to hear. I'll never know if I found Susan or if she found me, but I know that saving her ended up saving all of us. Catherine raised her face toward him, clay still wet on her hands. Dad, I think sometimes the people we save are the ones we most needed to be saved by. True healing begins when we stop hiding our wounds and allow others to see them. Susan nodded in agreement, her own hands pausing in their work. And when we learn that our greatest weakness can become our greatest strength, if we have the courage to be vulnerable with the right people. Did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. See you then.